Welcome to Fantasy or Reality, the GPP. Whatever road you took to get here doesn't matter. What matters is you're here. And my hope is that we all can help one another in this journey. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Fantasy or Reality, the GPP. Today, we have another special guest who reached out. He wanted to tell his story about his gambling, his road to recovery. And I'm very excited to have Alex with us to share his story. He reached out after listening to my podcast, and I'm very excited to have him on here and share his story. Hey, Alex, how you doing, buddy?
I'm doing well. How about yourself?
I'm doing great. Thank you. Thanks for doing this.
Yeah, no problem. No problem at all.
Cool. So like we were talking about before, therapy for me has been one of the biggest things for me. That's what's helped me a lot in uncovering a lot of how I feel and really digging into who I am and why I've done the things I've done. So like I told you before, I sat down with my therapist, and the first thing he asked me was, Steve, who are you? So Alex, who are you?
Well, to start with, I'm a human being, I'm an addicted gambler, been learning a lot about who I am in therapy and like the truth behind like the deeper truth behind some of the actions I've taken and all those different things. So I've been on that journey the past few months as well. So that's been a big help for me. So I'd say right now, it's still discovering a lot about who I am and opening up new doors through and getting the help I need through those avenues.
Cool. So I guess we'll jump right into it. Do you want to share your gambling story? When did you start? What age did you start? Tell us a little bit about your type of gambling, and we'll go from there, bud.
Okay. Yeah, I started gambling about 17 through, well, my original experience was I started through a free game called Streak for the Cash. I'm sure many people know what that game is. Um, I went to a website called eventually, I was pretty hooked with that game. So I went to found a community for that game, went to a forum called 27inarow.com, which is still an active website. There, they offered some like betting tips, talked about betting and uh avenues about that. So I started learning about that and I was like, well, I can I can beat the bookies. I can do this. I'm a knowledgeable guy. I've followed sports my whole life, that whole story. So eventually I decided to give it a shot. I think back then I would have been on probably a sportsbook.ag, which is an offshore book. I believe it's out of Costa Rica. So what you do there is you just deposit into the book with via credit card, debit card. I mean, some debit cards have more issues, but generally, a few different times trying, and I might have to go through a few like, is this fraud? Text.
Mhm.
Eventually you can get the process to go through because back then, cryptocurrency and all those type of avenues towards betting wasn't really a thing. So once you deposit, you go from there. I think my first deposit was probably $50 or something like that, $50, $100. And then and then from there you're just like you're in this community that also bets too. So naturally it just starts escalating from there. So it probably started as something that was innocent, but with my addictive personality, it just escalated from there. And then at a certain point, I was, you know, almost putting like whole paychecks into the stuff, or
Mhm.
as much with the paycheck that I could afford and then live on the other part. But the majority of it was going towards gambling.
And this was at 17.
Yeah, this was at 17. From I would say those that period probably lasted. I mean, there was probably a few hot and cold stretches, where I had other things come up, other things in life. But that was probably from 17 to 21, 22 with that stretch.
Okay, and that was Streak for the Cash, you said. So what is that, like sports betting?
No, Streak for the Cash, that's how it started. But
Oh,
Streak
okay.
for the Cash itself isn't sports betting. That's just
Oh,
a free game from ESPN.
gotcha. Sorry.
What you're using, like you learning, like you're going to like sportsbook to check odds, so to make your picks. So it just naturally escalated from there because I found the forum from Streak for the Cash, and that escalated towards eventually towards giving it a shot with betting. Because I mean, what 17, 18-year-old kids who's been in sports his whole life, or at least followed sports his whole life, tried sports, and doesn't think they can beat the bookies.
Yeah. Um, so that's what you mainly bet on. You did a lot of sports betting. Did you do any other type of gambling, or did you ever have any other type of addictions or anything like that?
Let's say 90, 95, 96% of it was sports betting. I mean, I've tried more types of gambling, Texas Hold'em poker. Some points down the road, I've tried cryptocurrency, stock market, uh, DFS, pretty much every avenue I've tried it, but sports betting has always been like my thing of choice.
Okay.
It's always been
Um, sorry, go
enjoyed.
ahead.
Yeah, sports betting's always been the one I've enjoyed the most.
Okay. Um, so when do you think it went from a fun time, a fun game you played, just betting a little bit here and there to make the sport maybe a little bit more fun? And then when do you think it turned into a problem? Or when did you start to realize that there was a problem?
Hmm. That's an interesting question because when you're deep in that moment, you oftentimes you don't realize it till later.
Yeah.
So for me, probably that whole period of like 19 to 22, because like I didn't even realize in the moment how bad it was, but then like years later, like you can kind of still get access to your old bets, or you can
Hmm.
kind of see your history. And years later, I was showing talking about it with a guy in a chat, and that's when it just like it hit me at just how deep it had gotten and how far along those lines I had went. Because when you're I don't know when the point where I would say I started putting like most of my paychecks, but I would say at least by 19 or 20, where just most of that 2 week paycheck was going into a sports book. And then also I had a Amazon credit card, so it was just little $1,000 limit. Thankfully. So I would, you know, probably 100, 200, 300 there, pay it off, go in that cycle too. But I
Yeah.
never opened up more credit cards than that. I never was going majorly into debt, like taking out loans for the stuff, but it was still destroying my life. I mean, I was just in that paycheck to paycheck cycle, the fun stuff.
Yeah, of course. Um, so, did you ever have any other type of other addictive tendencies, issues other than gambling? Anything that you've come across through your therapy? Um, anything like that?
I would say I tend to have like an addictive personality. I mean, I've tried alcohol. Never really been my thing. Never been a heavy drinker. I've
Yeah.
done cocaine, different things like that. And I wouldn't classify as I ever went heavy with those.
Hmm.
But if I would have been around that community, that crowd, then I definitely think there's a good chance that I would have went more down that road. It was just I never was in that type of community. So where I was in that type of community was with sports and sports betting.
Yeah, of course. And you mentioned that you played a lot of sports growing up. Do you think that contributed to your um, competitiveness, your desire to want to sports bet, stuff like that?
Yeah, definitely. Because I've always been a super competitive person. Like I'm that type of person. It's a board game, card game, sporting event. I play to win. Like I always want to win.
Yeah.
So
Um,
I think that naturally would have carried over into sports betting.
yeah. Do you have any times that you remember or stories that you remember where it just got so bad and you realized, you wanted to stop, right? But you couldn't stop and you kept going back to it over and over again. Because I know especially this last go around, the last few years that I bet, like I wanted to stop within a few months. probably earlier than that. Honestly, I wanted to stop, and I just could not. No matter what I did, different types of things to stop, I'd always end up back in it, and I just couldn't understand why. I knew I could potentially lose my family, uh, and it took a lot of digging and realizing like why I did the things I did. Um, but do you have any stories you'd like to share? Anything like that?
Yeah, absolutely. Um, I think there's been numerous points where I wanted to stop, like when I was deep into it, where it was basically like any addiction. It's consuming your life. So it's probably your first thought in the morning. It's your last thought before you go to sleep. You know, so I would say there's probably numerous times when I was doing whole paychecks where I would want to stop. And then I might even go through a 2 or 3 month, 4 month, 5 month, 6 month period where I might be pretty much stopped. But I would always go back down that road. Eventually, like, I don't know if it was like, I guess, like maybe something happens, maybe with a female, maybe life just gets hard, life just kicks you in the ass, which it can do sometimes.
Hmm.
Uh, it was always like it would always go back to it being that escape because you get whether you win or you lose in gambling, you get that just the more money you have, especially on the game, you get that massive adrenaline rush,
Yeah.
especially the closer the game is, the closer you are, whether it's that last second win or it's that last second loss, the bigger the adrenaline rush. So you're always it just became that escape for me. And I can just remember when I lost my twin brother at age 24. Uh, I can just remember me and my buddy, we'd already had tickets to WrestleMania before it happened. So we followed through with that because it was, we had the funeral and everything had already happened a couple weeks prior. So I can just remember I'm a big soccer guy, so I'm a Manchester City fan. So I remember just being in Mobile with my buddy, and he was refing a soccer game before we headed over to New Orleans later that day. Um, and I just went to a bar this morning to find the game, watch the game, and I remember having like a grand or something on that game on Manchester City to win, and they ended up blowing to a lead. But I can just remember that was kind of a low point where it was just because it's like you just realize like, man, what am I doing? What am I doing with my life? Where you just realize like how much of an escape it had been because
Yeah.
you're just I guess it's in those dark places like that, especially loss of a loved one. Like probably nothing forces you to just reevaluate your choices more than that. So I would say that definitely was a low point. But even after that, I didn't stop. Like I might have stopped for a while, but even then, I probably didn't. I would say last year was the point where it ultimately was like, okay, where I found myself slipping back into that road where I was like, okay, I have to stop. Like, this has to stop. Like, I don't want this to just keep destroying my life like it has for the past 10 years where I just have hardly any money, nothing to show for it.
Yeah. Now, you're like me, where we did this off and on for years, and we tried 100 different times to stop and did different things. I know you told me that your first, not your first, but you had stopped your betting back in, it was July of last year, right? Now, what was different? I'm sorry, and I know that there was one minor relapse, but you were able to stop it quickly back in January. But what was it back in that July that something just clicked that time where you were like, I can't do this anymore. Like I keep going over and over again. What was different from the times before that?
Oh, that's another tough question. I would say what was different is just being in that cycle so many times, like hundreds of times over the years. You're just finally like, look, I've told myself hundreds of times, like this is gonna be the time, I'm gonna be
Hmm.
consistent, I'm gonna be disciplined, but you're always like not prepared for that emotional high that you're gonna get. So in that I would always end up chasing losses or chasing a bigger win. So eventually I'm like, look, this isn't gonna change. This is insanity. This is you've done the same thing hundreds of times over and over and over and over. And you just nothing has changed. So at a certain point, like if you don't lay this down, you're going to be 30, 40, 50. 60 if you live that long, whatever, and you're gonna have nothing to show for your life, and that's just not who I wanted to be. So I was like, look, you've got to lay it down and find other avenues, other things, to take up your time.
Yeah, and I know, like I said, you had told me about the one quick relapse you had about 6 months later in January. And but what I find impressive about that is you made the bet, you realized immediately it was a mistake. And normally what we do when we relapse like that is it just keeps going and going, and now you're chasing, and it's just another cycle. So what was it that triggered you at that point to gamble after 6 months? But then also, what made you realize, okay, I tripped up here, but I'm going to once again stop and continue on this positive progressive path?
What made it trigger was probably just making some irresponsible financial choices, So even if the things aren't necessarily bad at what you did, it's still like the avenue and the way you went about it was still irresponsible and too much at one time. So I would say what made me stop was just knowing some of the triggers and deeper elements behind that from therapy and everything. So where it was just like, okay, I I know where this is headed, and I had to like, breathe, process those emotions, those feelings, those desires, and ultimately, experience them and then move on. Which is obviously a lot easier said than done for a person with an addictive personality.
Oh, for sure. I remember over and over again, like especially over the last year of my gambling, like through the pandemic and into the next, like through 2020 and into the next year, like I would be, scared about not making enough money. My hours were cut back, and I'd end up maxing out a credit card on DraftKings and be like, I cannot believe I once again maxed out this credit card at $4,000. What am I doing here? I'm going to lose everything. And I would tell myself, I'm just going to take one more withdrawal from my 401k and pay this, and I'm never doing this again. And it would always be within a day or a week. I'd be like, oh my God, I took this money out of my 401k. Now I have to replace this. So I can totally relate to financial triggers. For me, I mean, it was a mixture between financial and emotional triggers. I've had a lot of feelings of never feeling, I don't want to say never, but I would have feelings of not feeling, good enough, or feeling worthy for my family, or just feeling like if I don't provide enough, that eventually, they'll see through this, whatever, and then they'll leave me, even though I believe I'm a great partner, a great husband, and I give everything I can. I still realize through therapy and through a lot of discussion with my wife that will come up, these feelings of inadequacy. And, between that and the financial triggers, it was this cycle that kept going. And I remember before I got caught this last time, like you were talking about earlier, it's like we say, oh, we're only going to do, we try to set these limits. Like at this time, it's going to be different. This time, I'm only going to bet a little bit. I'm only going to bet this and that. So like for a few weeks before my wife had called me, I think I had paid off the card once again. And I told myself I'm just going to do it on weekends. So for, I don't know, like I said, maybe a month or so, I was just playing on Saturdays and Sundays. But I already know for sure that would have once again snowballed into an everyday thing, because daily fantasy you can do every day. Um, so I can completely relate to all that stuff. And I think a lot of people with our addiction um, struggle with that. We think that it's a control thing, but for people like us, we just have to surrender and realize that we just cannot gamble, and there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with the fact that we can't gamble, we can't use an addictive substance. That's fine. um so yeah, so what's your I'm sorry, I should have asked you in the beginning, what is your clean date, or when's the last day to bet for you?
Last date of bet is right now is 1/7/2022.
Okay, great, man, congratulations. And I
Cool.
should have mentioned in the beginning also, mine is 5/2/21. So um I know we were texting back and forth a bit, between, the first time we spoke and now. Do you want to talk about how you were able to get through the Super Bowl and how that was for you? Because for me, and what I've done is I just am not watching sports at all. I probably could watch and be fine, but it's just one of these things where I realize that's just something for me. I'm just not ready to watch it. It's not a risk I'm willing to take at this point. So, how did you handle the Super Bowl? How did you deal with it with your friends and family? How did you work through that?
Yeah, the Super Bowl was is definitely a difficult moment, a difficult time because for a sports better, the Super Bowl is probably the pinnacle. There's more options offered on the Super Bowl than any other game during the year. There's things like what color of the Gatorade will be poured on the winning coach, how many times will the chains be measured, and all kinds of different just crazy exciting things. Will there be a streaker on the field, and all kinds of crazy things like that. So there's just for that's just like a degenerate's paradise,
Yeah.
so to so it's just one of those events where it's like, all right, I know this is a trigger for me because like there's just so many different things you naturally think you can find an edge somewhere. So I had some friends who were just, they were betting the game. They had this one bet they were going a little bigger on, and I just was like, all right, I left that chat for a while, and just so because I didn't want to. I knew for me personally, even if that bet hit, I couldn't guarantee that I would cash out in that moment. So I
Mhm.
just for me, it was better off to not bet entirely there. So I didn't give in. Ultimately, I watched the last like 2 minutes of the game.
Mhm.
Ultimately, I just like I went into the gym for the first half and just kind of just avoided that whole spectacle around the day.
Yeah. And are you guys? You said it's sports betting is legal down in Alabama, also. Is that correct?
Sports betting is not legal in
Oh,
Alabama.
okay.
You have to you have to either go offshore or drive up to Tennessee, which
Okay.
offshore is not. It's a lot more accessible than most people probably think on the surface, especially with just cryptocurrency and those avenues. Because you have like Bovada out of Costa Rica, Sportsbook AGs like out of Costa Rica, and you got a lot of those avenues. So it's always been a thing that's been easy to do and easy to access because I can do it from my smartphone. I don't have to
Okay.
be sitting in front of a laptop. I don't. If I have those urges, I can pretty much pull out my smartphone. I can put some money on. I can give in. I can do it.
Yeah, I think that's what is going to be. I don't want to say difficult, but I think there's just going to be a lot more people that develop a gambling addiction over the next several years because of the accessibility and the fact you can do it from your phone. I mean, I could probably almost guarantee I this would have never happened if it wasn't for me. If it wasn't just so accessible for my phone, if like you couldn't bet at any time 24/7, like with DraftKings, you could build lineups 24/7, so sometimes I do it as I was getting ready for work in the morning, or I do it in the restroom when I'm home from work, or if I'm, this you could really do it at any time. And now with sports betting being so accessible, I can see this wave that's coming, and I know I've read some stats about how the helplines are getting a lot more calls. I know here in New York, I just read that there's been over $2 billion wagered in just New York since it became legal, and something like 1.87 million new accounts have been opened just in the last uh, nearly 2 months. And these are people who probably would have not bet before, probably would have not made a wager. And I'm not saying that they shouldn't. I'm not saying that people should be allowed to wager if they can. Do so responsibly. I know that the number is supposed to be around 2%. I believe it's much higher that have a gambling addiction or a propensity towards addiction or compulsive betting. So I don't think it should be necessarily illegal or anything like that. I just believe that there should be more funds directed in the way of help and prevention, and just the amount of ads that we see blasted on TV and through social media here. I think there should be a comparable amount for help that's out there, or for help through a therapist. Like for us in New York, our therapy, the one-on-one therapy, will be paid for through our council. but I know
Hmm.
you're saying that I think you said that wasn't the case in Alabama, right? And you part of the reason why you had those financial triggers is because you were going to therapy and you were paying for that. So, I would hope that someday in all 50 states that we can get this funding to help anyone who feels like they need it. So they don't have to have this burden or this feeling that they can't go because it can't be paid for. Because a lot of times people with a gambling addiction don't have the money at first to go seek out help.
Right, because chances are, if you've been in battle with a gambling addiction, chances are you're going to be on the broke side, if
Yeah.
not in a lot of debt. If not down that road as well. So I do think those things should be normalized. Like, for example, on a pack of cigarettes, you see all the addiction risk, you see the warnings and stuff like that, but it hasn't really got to that point with gambling yet. And
Yeah.
I do think, like, with those things, like, they have exploded the last probably with the rise of the smartphone. I think eventually things like gambling addiction, smartphone addiction, all those things, I think eventually those things will be more, like, talked about. They'll be more mainstream. There'll be more of those, like, warnings, but, a lot of those things we are pretty much in the beginning, still in a lot of the beginning stages because casinos have always been there and different things, but you haven't had just the 24/7 access up until probably the last 10, 15 years with that a smartphone has given you to sports books and different things like that. So I think we're still in the beginning stages of that.
Yeah, I think that's why it's important that people like you and I come out and tell our stories and kind of normalize that this is a problem for a lot of people, but it doesn't make them any less than the next person around. It just means we need a little help with this. Um, and whether that be 12-step meetings or other support groups or one-on-one therapy, um, I hope that the funding will be there one day for every person that needs the help. Um, but anyway, so um, you mentioned that you had been going to therapy. How has that worked for you? And have you found that really beneficial in self-evaluation for your addiction, just in life in general?
Yeah, I actually feel like it's been overall, it's been a great experience for me. It's been a blessing. It's been one of the best investments I've made because here's the thing with an addiction. With an addiction, it's an escape from reality. Like that's why you do it. That's where it starts. So I think there's always a deeper issue. There's always a deeper issue. There's always a deeper trigger that any person who is struggling with an addiction, I would say they need therapy just to get to the root cause, to get to the root cause of the issue. And so I think overall that whole experience it's been a blessing and just learning about myself, learning about different things that have affected my life and the way I am and different triggers. So I think that has been a blessing for sure. And I think that's probably the biggest reason I was able to not have that full relapse in January because I've still, watched sports over the past few months and I've still, you know, consumed them on a regular basis. And I've learned how to manage with that, and, I'm learning to take the appropriate steps. If I need to leave a chat, I need to leave a chat. And, people can understand or they can't, you just got to do what's best for you. So that's where I'm at with it. I overall, like, I don't feel on the average day, I don't feel the need anymore.
Mhm.
Uh, the Australian Open, which was the tennis, which was the last data bet I made. I mean,
Mhm.
it was a trigger because I had friends talking about it, but overall, it was the bigger trigger was because I was financially, I just made a few mistakes that I should have been more responsible and journaled through a few things and just managed those things a lot better. And ultimately, then that trigger would have been avoided, and the whole experience would have been avoided. So, I think therapy just helps you learn those issues and those type of things. It helps you get to the just deeper root cause that oftentimes we just buried like so deep inside of us that you need like that professional opinion and you need that like unbiased opinion to just help you get to the root cause and give you the directions basically. It won't tell you what it is, but just give you like the directions and the steps.
Yeah. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I've, like we've talked about, I go to different support groups, journal, this podcast, but I found really the most beneficial thing for me is therapy. So I would suggest for anyone that's struggling, that they may not feel comfortable going to a 12-step meeting or comfortable showing their face just yet. Of course you can listen to podcasts, you can read up on it, but going to a therapist, they're not going to judge you, and they're really just there to listen and to help. And they really have helped me dig so much into why. Like I know I've said this 100 times on my podcast before, but it's really been so beneficial for me to dig into why I've done the things I've done, to help me recognize when these triggers have happened. I know, in previous podcasts, or two ago, when I spoke with my friend John, I realized, that's something I thought I was upset at. It was really like three things removed that once again related back to, you know, those feelings of not being good enough, not feeling, you know, or feeling those inadequacies. But then it's good to, for me, it was good for me to almost go through that, because it helped me realize those types of triggers, those emotional triggers, which could, if left unchecked, lead me down a road I don't want to be on. Doesn't mean I'll bet the next day. Doesn't mean I'll bet the next year, but it's just a mindset I don't want to be in. And when I have too many of those things stack up and I'm in that negative mind space, that's where I don't want to be, because that could lead to something I don't want to be in, whether it's, even if it's just a depressive state, which, you know, could lead up me into anything, and I don't want to be there. And yeah, so I would suggest, if your state pays for it, go. If not, there are great sites out there. I know I've said it a few times. I think it's betterhelp.com. It has pretty reasonable rates, and you can do it from home on Zoom. Um, yeah. So, is there anything else you wanted to share about your addiction to gambling, or how you've been working through it these last few months?
Yeah, I would say a big thing is just like don't be afraid to tell people. Don't be even if because I think telling people just it gives you more accountability. It gives you like it's almost like the weight has been lifted in a sense because with gambling it's such a silent addiction. I don't have scars on my arms. I don't have you know all this type of things. I'm not slurring words. I don't have all those different type of things that come with other addictions. And so oftentimes people won't realize the extent because especially because it's one of those things it's mostly affecting yourself. So it's just one of those things that I would say seek that help. Tell your family, tell your loved ones, because if they're truly care and love you, then they will support you. And don't be afraid to take those avenues.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I know I was so scared to tell my entire family. I mean, my wife found out obviously on her own, but I told the rest of my family and friends, and the reactions I've gotten were nothing like I thought it was going to be. Most people are supportive and they're in your corner, and they just want you to do better and be better. How was it when you told your family, and was the reaction better than you thought it was going to be?
Well, I'm still in the process of telling family and different things, and that's like a big reason why I wanted to do this podcast because I just wanted to kind of put it all out there to family and friends and all that all at once instead of just having to go individual to individual. I'd rather just rip the whole band-aid off and put it all out there at once.
All right, Alex, thank you very much for sharing your story. Thanks for coming on here and being vulnerable. I know it's not easy. You remind me a lot of where I was, just a few months in. I reached out to another podcast host, and, it was only, I think, a month in, just like you were when you reached out to me, when I, thought the same thing, where it was like, I feel like the only way to truly do this is to be as open as possible, because I know I've talked to you about this before. I've had previous drug addictions, and I would always like get past it and then try to just shove it down and move past it and like put it behind me and pretend it didn't happen. And then these things would always pop back up. So I realized that this time around, I just had to be as open as possible. And I realized that these podcasts had helped me so much. So that's why I reached out. And yeah, you just It's just tough in those early days, but I remember being in those early days, not sure of how the people in my life were going to take it. And most people, like I said, really have been very supportive. And there's nothing wrong with us. We have this issue with, addiction, whether it be gambling or alcohol or whatever, but there's help out there. We can move forward with it. And I think the best thing to do is being open. So I really commend you on coming out here and telling your story. And I really appreciate you doing this, Alex. Thank you.
Right. I appreciate you giving me that opportunity.
Absolutely. Well, thank you everyone for listening. I really appreciate you taking the time out to listen to us tell our stories. And I look forward to talking with you all soon. Be good to yourselves. Here's where to get help. You can call or text 1-800-522-4700. That's the National Council on Problem Gambling. Or you could call 1-800-GAMBLER, 1-800-426-2537. This is where I found the link to my therapist through my local counselor. And then also, we cannot forget our affected others. My wife goes to Gamanon every week, and it's been a huge help to her. So anyone in your life who you feel like needs help or you've affected through your gambling, you can go to gamanon.org, GAM-ANON.org. The number is 718-352-1671.